Well, church, it is the 5th Sunday of Eastertide. We're not done with our Alleluias yet, but there is a change happening in the feeling of the season. For as we proceed throughout these great 50 days of Eastertide, we know, as we know the story, that at some point, Jesus will not feel so much present as absent. There will be a time when the church will feel him truly ascended to the Father, gone from our sight. We're going to have to grow up and learn to be alone. Well, this sense of Jesus leaving is just now on the horizon. It perhaps has not dawned on us and our sacred imaginations, but it is there. And you'll hear about it more and more as the weeks progress toward Pentecost. But for today, there is a slight hint in the scripture readings that, well, Jesus is getting ready to say goodbye. Now, of course, the very first time Jesus said goodbye was the night before he was handed over to death. What we celebrate in the church's calendar is Maundy Thursday, with the celebration of the Lord's Supper and the washing of feet. All of that was when Jesus said goodbye, that Passover night before he died on Good Friday. And that time, that night, when Jesus prepared his friends for his departure, was a bittersweet one. Quite unlike the bizarreness of the 50 days of Easter, that goodbye was a very real one. And it was painful to behold, because of course Jesus knew that the whole machinery of politics and rioting crowds and internal dynamics, even within his own tight circle of friends, was going to send him to his death. He knew it. He allowed it to happen. He allowed the whole mess of humanity's problems and sins and brokenness and corruption to do him in. Well, the whole thing starts rolling when he is there that night before he dies at the Passover table, and he passes a piece of bread to Judas, who he knows is going to betray him, who he knows is going to hand him over. He passes a piece of bread to him and says, "Whatever you're going to do it fast." And so Judas leaves. And at that point, yes, the action moves into what John's Gospel speaks of as Jesus' hour. And it's not an hour of 60 minutes. It's Jesus' hour, his defining moment. We understand that to be not only the moment that he is betrayed, but then as it moves toward his suffering, his abandonment by his friends, his moving to be crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem, and yes, into his resurrection life. That whole thing is his hour. The hour has come when he says, "My betrayer has left the room." And he says, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified." Did you see how many times? 5 times Jesus uses the word glorified, 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 on and on in the beginning of this gospel text. Now, when things look really bad, I am glorified, and the Father is glorified in me, Jesus says. This is just the beginning, but it is his hour. And he says to his friends gathered there, wondering what the hell is about to happen, he says, I'm not going to be here for much longer, but where I'm going, you cannot go. He said the same thing to an audience of Jewish folks earlier back in the 8th chapter of John's Gospel, and it was actually a horrible conversation. These same words now return on this night before he dies, and he says, "Well, as I've said before, I've got to go, and you can't." This hour that Jesus is entering into, what we now call the whole story of the cross and the empty tomb, that hour is the reason he is with us, why the Word has been made flesh. And we realize two things. Number one, only he could enter into that hour. No other person could. It was his reason for being Word made flesh, to enter into that hour and to reveal this story, to reveal this complete offering of God's love to humanity. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, well, this story is what makes us Christians. Jesus could have been a wonderful prophet. He could have just been an amazing teacher. He could have been known, I suppose, as one of dozens of amazing faith healers throughout the Middle East at that time, 2,000 years ago. But no, all of that is brought into a very different perspective when we realize that this is the story that makes us who we are. This hour of the cross and the empty tomb. And this is why, if you hold this story in your heart and you trust it, this is why you're a Christian. Because you choose to believe that in the power of this story is a complete revelation of God's love to the universe, to humanity. What's amazing to me, of course, then, is that everything that Jesus taught and all the people he healed and all the different ways that he forgave and reconciled with people, all of those things have new life because of his hour at the cross and through the empty tomb. All of those things, quite wonderful in and of themselves, are now evidence that such love and such healing and such teaching and such beauty cannot, will not die. Good news for you and for me, church. So Jesus goes where we cannot go and does what we cannot do for ourselves. We cannot reveal as human beings such an astonishing story. But God does through the Word made flesh. And in all that he does and says, he reveals it. And it cannot die. Well, here we are 2,000 years later. Jesus' hour has come and it has passed, and it is now our story. And we know in all four of the Gospels that Jesus means for us to pick up where he left off. Picks up where we left off. He says, just as I have loved you, so also you should love one another. So that everyone will know that you are my disciples by the love that you have for each other. That is what he says that night before he dies. Now, as we imagine ourselves in the church's calendar just inching toward this realization that the risen Jesus may truly be gone, absent from us, we will have to cover that in greater depth and detail in the future. But today, the basics. Love one another. Those are the basics. Now, when Jesus shares this powerful message with his friends to love one another, I have to admit that during this week as I was studying these scriptures and I was pondering quite what to